The road into Hendra Flats was 12 miles of bad intention dressed up as a trail. It crossed 2 dry washes, climbed a red rock shelf that broke wagon wheels the way a man breaks kindling, and then descended into the valley floor with the kind of abruptness that suggested the land itself had lost patience with the journey. By the time Opal Drennan reached the bottom of that descent on a Thursday morning in late September, she had one boot with a sole held on by a strip of rawhide she had cut from her bag strap, and a disposition that had moved some distance past tired and was approaching something she had no polite word for. She was 37 years old, and she had been traveling for 11 days. Before that, she had been in Tucson for 4 months, trying to make a go of a laundry with her sister-in-law. And before that, she had been in the wreckage of a life she was done examining. Her husband, Prentice, had died 18 months ago. Not heroically, not in any way that made a good story, but of drink and poor decisions compounded over many years until his body simply declined to continue. She had not mourned him the way people expected. She had mourned the years, which was a different thing. And then she had gotten up and started looking for what came next. What came next, apparently, was Hendra Flats. She had a letter from her late husband's cousin, a man named Virgil Foss, who ran a modest cattle operation south of the town and who had written that he needed someone to keep his house and that he would pay fair wages and provide a room. She had written back, accepting. She had spent her last $12 on the stage to the junction, and the rest of the journey had been accomplished by foot and by the charity of a freight wagon driver who had let her ride in the back among the flour sacks for the final 30 miles, which had done nothing good for her dress. She arrived in Hendra Flats looking like a woman who had been rained on, which she had, and muddied, which she also had, and she carried a carpet bag in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. The rope was old and good and had been her father's. She carried it the way other women carried a Bible, not because she planned to use it at any particular moment, but because it had been his and she was not ready to put it down. The main street of Hendra Flats was 2 blocks of timber buildings facing each other across a dirt road that the recent rains had turned to a reddish clay that grabbed at boots and held on. There was a saloon, a general store, a smithy, a church that wanted paint, a land office whose sign had come half off its bracket, and a hotel called the Frontier that appeared to be open if the lamp in the window was any indication. There were people on the street, and the people looked at her, and she looked back at them, and the looking had nothing warm in it on either side. She was making her way toward the hotel to ask directions to the Foss place when it happened. She heard it before she saw it. A sound like a wall coming down, a crashing, splintering crack from the direction of the livery yard at the north end of the street, and then immediately after it, the particular sound of a horse in full panic, hooves on packed dirt moving fast and getting faster. People on the street turned toward the sound. Some of them stepped back. Some of them simply stood and watched. The horse came around the corner of the livery at a dead run. It was a big gray gelding, 16 hands at least, and it had a broken halter rope trailing from its head, and its eyes were showing white, and it was coming down the main street of Hendra Flats at the speed of a problem that has decided to become everyone's problem at once. Behind the livery yard fence, 3 cowhands were moving. One was climbing down from the rail where he had apparently been sitting when the gelding broke loose. One was trying to catch his own horse, which had taken exception to the commotion. The third was standing with his rope in his hand, looking at the gelding, and looking at the distance between them, and calculating, by his expression, that the mathematics were not in his favor. On the street, people scattered. A woman pulled a child off the boardwalk. A man stepped back into a doorway. The gray kept coming straight down the middle of the street, hooves throwing up red clay, the broken rope snapping behind it. Opal dropped the carpetbag. She did not think about it in any way she could have later described. She simply dropped the bag and shook out the coil of rope in 2 movements, the way her father had taught her when she was 9 years old in the East Texas scrub, and she stepped off the boardwalk into the street. She built the loop on the second swing. She had grown up roping everything that moved on her father's place because he had no sons, and she was the oldest, and the work did not wait for gender. She had roped calves and steers and horses, and once, memorably, a mule that had eaten half a kitchen garden and needed to be relocated from the premises. She had not roped anything in 3 years, but the knowledge was in her hands the way certain knowledge is, below thought, below intention, simply there. The gray was 20 feet away when she threw. The loop settled over the horse's head cleanly, and she planted her boots in the mud and took the rope across her hip the way her father had taught her and held on. The gray hit the end of the rope and threw her forward 2 steps, and she held. A 3rd step, her boots slipping in the clay, and she dug in and held. The horse pulled up. Not all at once, not gently, but it pulled up, swinging its head. And she kept the pressure steady and even and talked to it in the low, constant voice she used for animals that were frightened, which was not words exactly, but a sound, a tone, a signal that said, "Nothing here is going to hurt you if you will only let me show you." The gray stood. Its sides heaved. It was still wild-eyed, but it had stopped running, and that was what mattered. She heard the silence then. The street was quiet in the way it gets quiet when something unexpected has occurred, and people are deciding what to think about it. Then, from the direction of the livery fence, she heard laughing. It was not kind laughter. It was the laughter of men who had been embarrassed by their own inaction and had found, in the time it took for the situation to resolve itself, a way to rearrange that embarrassment into something else. One of the 3 cowhands, the one who had been sitting on the rail, called out that she had gotten mud on her skirts doing it, which he apparently found very funny. The second one said something she did not fully catch, but that had the shape and weight of mockery. The third one said nothing, but was smiling in the way of a man who agrees with what the others are saying, but has enough sense not to say it himself. She stood in the mud with the rope in her hands and the gray trembling at the end of it, and she looked at the 3 men on the fence. Then she looked away from them because they were not worth the attention, and she looked at the gelding, and she walked toward him slowly with the rope running through her hands until she reached his head and put her palm flat against his jaw and felt him tremble, and then, gradually, still. She heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. She turned. He was coming from the direction of the hotel. Tall, dark-haired, silver at the temples, wearing a gray canvas work shirt and suspenders over heavy dungarees and boots that had seen every kind of weather the territory could produce. He was broad across the shoulder, and he moved with the ease of a man who has never had to announce himself because rooms rearranged themselves when he entered them. He was maybe 45, and he had a face that the sun and the years had made into something angular and unsparing. And he was looking at her with dark eyes that were doing several things at once, none of which she could entirely read. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at the horse, and then at the rope in her hands, and then at the mud on her skirts, and then back at her face. He said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at the 3 men on the livery fence, and something in his expression shifted, just barely, in a way that made the laughter stop. He looked back at her. "That is my horse," he said. "He is unhurt," she said. "The halter rope broke. You will want to check the rest of his tack." A pause. "You know horses." "I know enough." He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment and then handed him the rope, and when their hands were both on it for a moment in the transfer, She felt the roughness of his palm against her fingers, and she let go. "Dutch Haller," he said. "Opal Drennan. I am looking for the Foss place, Virgil Foss." Something moved across his face. She could not identify it. "Virgil Foss," he said. "Yes, he is my late husband's cousin. He wrote offering work." Dutch Haller was quiet for a moment in a way that had weight to it. "Virgil Foss died 6 weeks ago," he said. "Heart," they said. It was quick. She looked at him. She held very still. She was good at holding still when things fell apart around her because she had had considerable practice, and she had learned that stillness was not the same as not feeling it. It was simply what you did with the feeling while you decided what to do next. "I see," she said. "Did you have somewhere else to go?" "Not at present." He looked at the carpet bag in the mud of the street where she had dropped it. He looked at her one good boot and her one boot with the rawhide sole. He looked at her face, which was giving nothing away because she had decided before she was 20 years old that her face was not a place where the world got to watch her suffer. "I have a ranch 4 miles south," he said. "I need a cook and a housekeeper. The last one left in July, and I have been managing badly." "You are offering me a position based on the evidence of the last 4 minutes?" she said. "I am offering you a position based on what I just watched you do," he said. "The last 4 minutes told me enough." She looked at him. She looked at the mud on her skirts and the broken-soled boot and the carpet bag lying in the road. She looked at the 3 cowhands on the livery fence who had gone quiet and were watching this exchange with the expressions of men trying to work out how things had moved so quickly from where they were to where they were now. $2.50 a week, she said. "Room and board." "Done," he said without hesitation, which told her she had asked too little. She filed that away. He picked up her carpet bag from the mud before she could reach it. She noted that he did not make a production of it. He simply picked it up as if it were a natural thing to do and not a statement of any kind. "I'll have someone drive you out in an hour," he said. "There is a room at the hotel where you can wait." "I would rather see to the horse first," she said, "if you will permit me." He looked at her. Something in the dark eyes adjusted very slightly, like a lens finding its focus. "All right," he said. Dutch Haller was the largest landowner in the Hendra Flats Valley. He ran 2,000 head of cattle on 18,000 acres of grass and red rock and had built every inch of it from a single 160-acre homestead claim he had filed at 22 with $40 and a horse and a willingness to work that people who witnessed it in those early years still talked about. He had done it alone. He had a wife once, a woman named Cecilia who had come from Ohio with good intentions and bad lungs, and who had made it through 2 winters before the 3rd one took her. He had buried her in the hill behind the main house, and he had kept working because work was the only thing that did not ask him to feel anything he was not equipped to feel. He had a son, 14, named Griffin, who was in school in Santa Fe and who came home summers. He had 8 ranch hands, a cook shed separate from the main house, and a foreman named Peck Warden who had been with him for 11 years and who was competent and loyal and who regarded the arrival of a female housekeeper with the neutral expression of a man who has learned not to offer opinions about his employer's decisions. Opal arrived at the Haller Ranch in the back of a buckboard driven by a hand named Cree, who said almost nothing the entire 4 miles, but who moved her bag from the wagon bed to the porch without being asked, which she appreciated. She stood on the porch of the main house and looked at it. It was a good house. Stone foundation, timber walls, a pitched roof that had been recently repaired over the east section, wide windows, a porch that ran the full front of the building. Someone had planted something in the window boxes once, and it had died and not been replanted. The kitchen garden on the south side of the house had the look of a place that had been neglected long enough to become a project. She went inside. The house was clean in the way that things are clean when a man is living in them alone and has certain standards but no one to help him maintain them, which meant the floors were swept but the windows needed washing. The kitchen was serviceable, but the shelves wanted reorganizing, and there was a layer of fine dust on every horizontal surface that spoke of months without careful attention. It was not dirty. It was simply a house where no one had looked at the details in a long time. She put her bag in the room she was shown, which was at the back of the house and had a window looking out toward the southern pastures. And she washed her hands and face and changed her dress and tied her hair back and went to the kitchen and began. Dutch came in for supper that first evening to find the kitchen reorganized, the floor scrubbed, the windows on the south side washed, and a meal on the table that was the best thing, by his own later admission, that had been put in front of him since July. He sat down across the table from his foreman, Peck, and the two of them ate in the silence of men who have been making do for long enough that the return of a decent meal is too significant to comment on directly. Opal ate at the end of the table, which was where she had decided she would eat, and she watched the two men the way she watched most things, with a quiet, comprehensive attention that took in a great deal and gave back very little. She noted that Dutch ate without looking up, which was habit and not rudeness. She noted that he said a brief grace before the meal, just a few words, said quickly and without performance, which told her the faith was genuine and not for show. She noted that when Peck said something about the south pasture fence, Dutch listened with his whole attention, and that his answer was measured and specific, and showed a man who knew every inch of what he owned. After supper, he pushed back from the table and looked at her for the first time since she had sat down. "This is the best meal this kitchen has produced in 3 months," he said. "I would not know about 3 months," she said. "I know about tonight." He looked at her a moment. Then he stood and took his cup and went to the sitting room, and she heard the sound of him settling into a chair. The cowhands were the problem she had expected them to be. There were 3 who worked the home pastures, rotating with the others who covered the far range, and among the 3 who were most often in the yard were 2 she recognized from the street in town. Their names were Hennessy and Boyle. Hennessy was the one who had called out about her skirts. Boyle was the one who had said the things she had not fully caught. They were not cruel men in any dramatic sense. They were simply men who had decided in the first 5 minutes that she was a figure of amusement, and who had not yet found a reason to revise that position. The third regular hand, a young man named Cree, who had driven her out from town, maintained a careful neutrality that she recognized as the position of someone not powerful enough to take a side and smart enough to know it. On her 3rd morning, Hennessy came to the kitchen door during the breakfast hour and told her that the cook shed was where the hands ate and that she should know they had preferences. She looked at him. "The cook shed has its own cook for the hands," she said. "Bertram, I saw him this morning. He manages the hands' meals. I manage the main house. If you have preferences for the main house kitchen, you will need to speak to Mr. Howler about whether they are relevant." Hennessy looked at her. He had not expected a complete sentence in response. Most of the women he had encountered in his life in positions like hers had either deferred or apologized, and she had done neither. He went away. She heard him tell Boyle about it in a yard. She could not hear what Boyle said in return. On her 5th morning, she found the kitchen garden. She had known it was there, but she had not had time to look at it properly. She went out with a cup of coffee at 5:30 before anyone else was about, and she walked the rows of it and saw what was salvageable and what was not. There were volunteer tomatoes that had come back on their own. There were onions that had gone to seed but whose bulbs were still good if she dug them now. There was a rosemary bush that had survived everything, including neglect, which was the nature of rosemary. There were the dead stalks of what had been, she thought, kitchen herbs, and the soil under them was good, red and loose and willing. She stood in the garden with her coffee and looked at it and thought that this was rescuable. She heard the porch door. Dutch came out at 6, the way she had learned he always did, with his coffee, and he stood on the porch and looked at the morning the way he always did, which was with a thoroughness that suggested the morning contained information he was checking against some internal measure. He saw her in the garden, and he stopped. She looked up. "The soil is good," she said. "It was my wife's," he said, and then, as if he had not meant to say it, "She grew everything in it." She looked at the garden and then at him. He was looking at the rosemary bush. "I will grow it back," she said. He looked at her, not for long. "All right," he said, and drank his coffee and looked at the morning. She planted what she could salvage and ordered the rest of what she needed from the general store in town. She planted onions and beans and 2 kinds of squash and the herbs she could get seeds for, and she did it in the mornings before the heat came and in the early evenings when the light was going amber and the air smelled of warm earth and sage. It was satisfying work, and it did not ask anything of her beyond attention and patience, which she had in abundance. On the second week, she found the shelf above the back door had a broken bracket. She asked Cree for a hammer and nails and fixed it herself, which Cree watched with an expression of mild bafflement and then went away to do something else. On the afternoon she fixed the shelf, Dutch came in from the yard and saw her on the step stool with the hammer. He stopped in the doorway. "I can send one of the hands to do that," he said. "I already have the hammer," she said, and drove the last nail. He watched her step down from the stool and test the bracket, which held solidly. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said. "My father had no sons," she said. The work did not wait. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't." He poured himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, which he had not done before, and she put the hammer away and began the preparations for the evening meal. And they were in the same room, doing different things, and neither of them found any need to fill the silence. And that was the moment she began to understand that this man was not what she had expected when she stepped off a street into his life. The slow understanding between them had no dramatic moments in it. It was made of small things. It was made of the way he left the lamp burning in the kitchen when he knew she would be up late if there was preserving to do, so she would not have to find it in the dark. It was made of the way she kept a plate back for him on the evenings he came in after the meal was cleared, without being asked, and set it at his place, and he ate it without comment, but always, she noticed, without a word of complaint. It was the way he began to linger in the kitchen after the evening meal for a few minutes longer each time, his coffee cup in his hand, not talking much but present, which was its own kind of talking. It was made of the morning she was working in the kitchen garden and she pulled a muscle in her back hauling a bag of compost, and she straightened up slowly with her hand pressed to the small of her back, and he was at the fence watching her and he said nothing. But the next morning, there was a low garden cart at the gate, freshly built from clean pine, with a note in his handwriting that said, "Use this." That was all, just, "Use this." She put the note in her apron pocket and went to work, and did not mention it, and neither did he. But for the rest of that day, she was aware of a warmth in her chest that she kept having to push back down because it was not useful, and she was not ready for it. The trouble came in the form of a woman named Vera Stout. Vera Stout was the daughter of the man who had originally sold Dutch Haller his second section of land, which gave her a sense of history with the ranch that she had never quite managed to convert into any actual claim on it. She was 40 and handsome in a cold way, and she had been for years the woman that people in Hendra Flats assumed Dutch would eventually marry. not because he had indicated any such intention, but because she was present and persistent, and the town had simply arranged the story without consulting either of the people it concerned. She came to the ranch on a Saturday afternoon, driving her own buggy, with a pie on the seat beside her and the expression of a woman making a social call that has more edges to it than social calls usually require. She came to the front door and Opal answered it, and the look that passed between them in the first 3 seconds said everything the next hour was going to confirm. Vera Stout looked at Opal the way a woman looks at something that has appeared in a place where it does not belong and that she intends to correct. "I am here to see Dutch," she said. "He is in the south pasture," Opal said. "I can send word." "I will wait," Vera said, and came in. She sat in the parlor, and Opal brought tea because that was the work, and she did the work regardless of who it was for. And Vera sat with the tea and looked around the parlor and said, in the tone of a woman who has practiced the sentence until it sounds casual, "You have made some changes." "The house needed attention," Opal said. "It was fine as it was." Opal looked at her. "I am glad to hear it," she said, and went back to the kitchen. Dutch came in an hour later. She heard him in the parlor with Vera, the low sound of voices, and she did not listen to the content because it was not her business. But she heard the tone, which was the tone of a man being managed and tolerating it because he did not yet see the better alternative. Vera left without the pie, which she had apparently forgotten on the buggy seat. Opal found it there the next morning when she went out to the garden, and she brought it in and set it on the kitchen table and thought about it, and then cut it and put a slice on a plate and left it at Dutch's place for breakfast, because wasting a good pie on anyone's feelings was something she was disinclined to do. Dutch came in and looked at the pie and looked at her and said, "Vera's pie." "She left it," Opal said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down and ate the pie without another word, and she thought that whatever the situation between him and Vera Stout was, he was not as sentimental about it as Vera appeared to be. Vera came back 2 weeks later. This time, Dutch was in the yard when she arrived, and Opal watched from the kitchen window as the two of them stood by the buggy and talked. She watched Vera's posture, which was the posture of a woman pressing a case, and Dutch's, which was the posture of a man who has heard the case before and remains unmoved. Vera pointed toward the house at one point. Dutch said something. Vera's expression tightened. She got back in the buggy and drove away. Dutch came inside and poured himself coffee and stood at the window. "She says you are unsuitable," he said. "That a widow woman with no people and no history in this valley is not fit to be keeping this house." Opal was rolling pastry. She did not look up. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that the state of my household was not something she had a say in." He paused. "I also told her that the woman in my kitchen stopped a runaway horse in the middle of a public street with a rope throw that some of the men I employ could not have matched, and that her opinion of what is suitable has some catching up to do." Opal looked up. He was looking out the window, not at her, with his coffee cup in both hands. She looked back down at the pastry. She pressed her rolling pin down and pushed away from her, and she thought about a man who had said that to a woman who had been telling him what was and was not acceptable for probably a very long time, and what it cost to say it. And she was quieter than usual for the rest of the afternoon. Vera Stout was not finished. She went to the town women. She went to Mrs. Aldridge, who ran the millinery, and to the minister's wife, and to 3 or 4 others, and what she told them was assembled from truths and implications in the way of someone who understands that you do not have to lie if you arrange the facts carefully enough. She said that the Drennan woman had arrived in Hendra Flats with nothing, that no one in the valley could vouch for her, that her late husband had been a man of poor reputation, and that Dutch Holler was a man who had been alone long enough to make foolish decisions about who he put in his house. Opal heard about it from Cree, who told her the way young men tell difficult things, quickly and with the expression of someone who wants to hand the problem off and run. She listened to all of it, then she thanked him and went back to what she was doing. She did not sleep well that night, not because Vera Stout's words had broken anything in her, but because she had been here before, in the position of a woman who has built something small and decent out of nothing, and then watched someone decide to knock it down. And she was tired of it. Not defeated, tired. There was a difference, and she knew it well. She was at the kitchen table before dawn with her hands around a cup of coffee and the darkness outside the window, and she heard the porch creak, and then Dutch was in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, up earlier than usual, and he stopped when he saw her. "You heard," he said. "Yes." He came in and poured his coffee and sat down at the table across from her, which he had begun to do in the evenings but had not done before at this hour, and he sat with his hands around the cup and he looked at her. "It will pass," he said. "It may not," she said, "not without cost to you, and I will not be the thing that costs you your standing in this valley." She looked at him. "I can find other work. I am not without skills." "I know you are not," he said. "I watched you stop a gray gelding with your father's rope and your boots in the mud and 3 men standing there doing nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not particularly interested in what Vera Stout thinks is suitable. I am interested in what I know to be true." She looked at him in the early dark of the kitchen and the lamp between them, and she said, "Dutch." "I know," he said. "I know this is not the arrangement you came here for. I know you have not asked for any of it." He turned his cup in his hands. "I also know that I have not eaten this well or felt this much at home in my own house since Cecilia died. And I am not sure what to do with that except to say it." She was quiet. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, somewhere in the dark of the pre-dawn, a rooster announced itself at the wrong hour. "You are telling me something," she said. "I am trying to," he said. "I am not particularly good at it." She looked at her coffee and then at him. "You are doing well enough," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. Just his hand over hers. Just that. Just the warmth and the weight of it. And she looked at where his hand was, and she thought about 11 days on the road and 37 years of one thing and then another, and a horse coming down a street and a rope in her hands and a choice made in a second that had led to this table and this kitchen and this man's hand on hers in the dark before dawn. She turned her hand over. She did not pull it away. The valley needed to make up its mind about her, and it took a little longer to do it than the kitchen did. The thing that moved it was not any one moment, but an accumulation of them. There was the Sunday in October when old Harlan Dempsey's mule got into his kitchen garden at the edge of town, and Opal, who was walking to the general store, roped it from the street and returned it to its pen without breaking her stride, which was witnessed by 4 people who found it in their own interest to describe the event accurately. There was the morning Mrs. Aldrich's youngest boy was bitten by a range dog, and Opal happened to be on the street when it happened, and she cleaned the wound and bandaged it with a calm incompetence that impressed Mrs. Aldrich enough to prompt a revision in her position. There was the evening she sat with the minister's wife while her husband was sick with a chest cold, and the minister's wife found her, in the morning, to be a woman of good sense and genuine faith who prayed simply and without ostentation, which was the minister's wife's preferred style. None of these things unmade Vera Stout's campaign, but they put weight on the other side of the scale. Vera forced the confrontation in November. She came to the ranch on a weekday morning when she had calculated Dutch would be in the far pastures overseeing the last of the autumn work, and she came with Mrs. Aldrich and the minister's wife and 2 others. And she came with the posture of a woman who has decided that a delegation is more persuasive than a conversation. Opal answered the door. She saw the group and she understood what it was. She opened the door wider and said, "Come in," which surprised Vera enough that she hesitated for a moment before entering. They sat in the parlor. Opal made tea. She brought it on the good tray and poured it without her hands shaking, which they wanted to do, and she sat and looked at Vera Stout and waited. Vera said what she had come to say. She said it with the structure of something rehearsed, which it was. She said that the women of Hendra Flats had a responsibility to the moral character of the community. She said that Opal's presence in the Haller household was, in the view of many, irregular. She said that Dutch Haller was a respected man, and that a respected man deserved a household that reflected his standing, which was to say, a household arranged according to proper principles, which was to say, one that was not run by a woman of uncertain history. Opal let her finish. Then she said, "Mrs. Stout, you have come a long way to say something that would have been just as effective in a letter. I appreciate the effort. I would like to say something in return." Vera's mouth thinned. Opal looked at the women in the room. She looked at Mrs. Aldrich, whose son's arm was healing cleanly. She looked at the minister's wife, who had the expression of a woman wishing she had not come. She looked at the other 2, whom she knew less well, but whose faces told her they had come because they were asked, and not because they were convinced. "I arrived in this valley with a broken boot and 37 years of work behind me, and a rope that belonged to my father," she said. "I stopped a horse that 3 men did not stop. I have kept this house, maintained this kitchen, planted this garden, and done every piece of work that was asked of me, without complaint and without asking for anything I was not offered. I have not been irregular. I have been useful. And the difference between those 2 things is something I would ask you to consider carefully before you make any further decisions about my history." She looked at Vera. "As for Mr. Haller," she said, "he is a man who makes his own decisions. That is his right. And what he decides is not something any of us in this room have the standing to override." A silence. The minister's wife set down her teacup. She looked at Opal, and then she looked at Vera, and something moved in her face that resolved, quietly, in Opal's direction. She said, "I think, Vera, that we have said what needed saying." She stood up. 2 of the others followed. Vera sat for a moment longer. Her expression had the quality of a woman who has lost a position she had not expected to lose and does not yet know how to leave it. Then she stood and left, and the others went with her, and Opal sat in the parlor alone for a few minutes and breathed. Then she went back to the kitchen. Dutch came in that evening, and she told him what had happened, because she was not a woman who kept things from the people they concerned, and she told it plainly and without embellishment. He listened. His jaw tightened once when she mentioned the word irregular, and then it loosened, and he was very still. When she finished, he said, "I am sorry you had to do that alone." "I was not alone," she said. "Your minister's wife is a perceptive woman." He looked at her. "What you said to them?" "It needed saying." "It did," he said. I should have said it first. He looked at his hands on the table. I have not been fast enough about a number of things. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire was burning low, and the lamp was doing what lamps did in October, making everything amber and smaller and closer than the daylight made it. What would you have said? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that you are the best thing that has happened to this house in a very long time. That I would be a fool to let anyone talk me out of something that is the truest thing I have known since Cecilia. He paused. And that I would very much like you to stay. Not as the housekeeper. She looked at him for a long time. I have a broken boot, she said, and a rope, and 42 years of being told what I am and am not suited for. You stopped a runaway horse barehanded in front of 3 men who did not move, he said. I think you are suited for most things. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She looked at the man across from her who had left a lamp burning so she could find the kitchen in the dark, and built a garden cart from clean pine, and said without any decoration the truest things she had heard in years. Then I will stay, she said. Not as the housekeeper. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. They were married in December, on a day when the first real frost had come and the valley was still and silver white at dawn, and by mid-morning had gone the color of pale gold. The ceremony was in the church that wanted paint, which Dutch had paid to have painted in November, and which now looked clean and honest against the winter sky. The minister's wife had arranged flowers from somewhere, dried things, sage and winter grass, and one stubborn sprig of rosemary from the kitchen garden that had survived the frost, which Opal wore pinned to her dress. Griffin Haller came home from Santa Fe for it. He was 14 and had his father's eyes and a reserve that was the reserve of a boy who has learned to protect himself from attachments that might leave. And he watched Opal throughout the ceremony with the careful attention of someone conducting an assessment. On the morning after the wedding, he came to the kitchen before breakfast and sat at the table and said, "My mother's garden." "Yes," Opal said. "You planted it back." "What I could reach of it," she said. "There is more to do in spring." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She liked rosemary best." "I know," Opal said. "I found the records she kept. In the back of the shelf behind the seed jars, she wrote everything down." Griffin looked at her. His face did something complicated and then resolved into something simpler. "All right," he said, and reached for the cornbread. She thought about that later, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the frost on the garden. And she thought it might be the most important thing anyone had said to her since she stepped off a freight wagon into a muddy street and heard a horse coming around a corner at a dead run. All right. 2 words. A door opening. The spring came and Opal planted the garden back with everything the records described, the onions and the beans and the kitchen herbs and the 2 climbing roses that Cecilia had started from cuttings and that Opal found dormant in the cold frame and brought back to life with warm water and patience. Dutch watched her work from the fence one morning, the way he watched her work sometimes, with the particular quality of attention of a man who is paying a kind of debt he cannot pay with money. She looked up and saw him watching. She would have liked this, he said. Someone who understood it. Opal looked at the garden and then at him. I did not know her, she said. But I have read everything she wrote down, and I think she was someone who understood that taking care of a thing was the same as saying you believed in it. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Yes, that is exactly what she was. And then, it is what you are." She pressed her hands into the soil and did not trust herself to speak, but she thought that was all right. She thought some things were said well enough without words. Hennessy and Boyle had been reassigned to the far range by January, which Dutch had done without drama and without explaining his reasons to anyone who did not need to understand them. Cree had been promoted to lead hand on the home range and had taken on this role with a quiet seriousness that suited him. Peck Warden had shaken Opal's hand at the wedding with the expression of a man who is relieved that things have worked out in a way that makes his job easier, which she found entirely honest and therefore endearing. Vera Stout sold her property in February and moved to Albuquerque to stay with her sister. The town did not speak of this as a consequence of anything in particular. The town did not need to. By summer, the garden was full. By summer, Griffin came home and worked beside his father and came to the kitchen in the evenings and talked to Opal about school and about horses and about a girl in Santa Fe named Margaret who had written him a letter, which he mentioned sideways and without looking at her, and she received the information sideways and without looking at him, and they were both, she thought, very comfortable with this approach. By summer, she had learned that the rope her father had given her, the one she had carried across 11 days and the full length of a muddy street, had not been a relic she was holding on to. It had been a tool she was carrying toward the moment she would need it. She had needed it for 4 seconds. Those 4 seconds had brought her to this kitchen, this garden, this man's hand in hers, at a table where the lamp was always burning and the door was always open, and the rosemary in the window box was the color of everything she had not known she was looking for until she was already standing in the middle of it. She had not set the rope down. It hung on the peg by the back door, her father's rope, worn and good and without apology, and sometimes Griffin would ask her to teach him, and she would take it down and show him how to build the loop and how to plant your feet and how to hold on, and Dutch would lean on the fence and watch with those dark, steady eyes, and the smallest thing in his face that was not quite a smile, but was everything a smile was made of. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough, and you kept going anyway, then you know something of who Opal Drennan was. She did not arrive where she arrived by waiting. She arrived by reading the situation faster than anyone around her, by moving before the moment closed, and by holding on. The world is full of women like her, quiet and capable and underestimated right up until the moment they are not. If this story settled something in you today, give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story from this valley. And leave a comment and tell us, have you ever moved when everyone else stood still? Have you ever held on when every reasonable voice said, let go? We would love to know. Until next time, take good care of yourselves and of the people who need you. We will be here when you get back.